Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's great to have Peter and Lucy back with us today. I'm just going to invite Peter to come up and tell us a little bit about what he's been doing over the past few months. Peter, I wonder if you could just remind us what a sabbatical is and some of the things that you've been doing during your time.
Yeah. So, being a church worker isn't the only profession that has a sabbatical. It's something that a few professions have, but it's fairly unusual, and you might be thinking, I wish I had one of those in my job. But I think the reason for this sort of extended study leave is because working for a church is not a 9-to-5 job. It's a much more 24/7 type of job, and so many churches, after 7 years, the Sabbath idea of 7 years, will give somebody working for the church a extended time of study leave, time for rest and recuperation. So I've been here now 14 years, and the church very kindly 7 years ago allowed me a few months a time like that, and then once again over the last term. So thank you very much. I know it puts extra pressure on some people. It creates some great opportunities, maybe. It's like he's gone, brilliant. But thank you very much. It's been a great blessing,
Great. So what are some of the things that you might have been doing during that time, or you might have studied, you might have learned?
Yeah. One of the things I've learned just this morning, well, two things that really stood out to me this morning. One, somebody said to me, "Oh, is this your first time here?" Which is great, isn't it? I think we are a church that tries to welcome people, so brilliant if that was you. But the other thing, I've been reminded how good our singing is. I've had an opportunity to visit quite a lot of other churches. It's something you don't get to do very often when you work for a church. You're busy on Sunday, and I've been reminded how well we sing, so well done. But the other thing that it's reminded me is this is the outgoing term card. So we produce one of these 3 times a year. It just tells you what's happening this term. There'll be a new one of these coming out soon for this autumn term, right up to the end of the year. But over the last 14 years, we've been producing this, and on the back it's got helpful contact. It's got who the elders are, who the deacons are, who you can do. But it also says ministers, all the congregation. A minister in a church is someone who serves, and here it says all the congregation do that. And actually, one of the things that I've realised and been reminded of is how it sort of didn't matter that I wasn't here. Things carried on. People worked very hard, I'm sure, but things happened. Things maybe happened even better in some cases, and people have just gone on with things in church life. And so what it says on here isn't a lie. It's true, and so well done. So that's one thing that stood out to me. It's also been a chance for me to go to 1 or 2 conferences and some training. I went to something that helps you to improve your preaching. You had to take along some preparation for a sermon and then get some feedback on that. But it's good for you, isn't it, to do that sort of thing. I've been able to reconnect with 1 or 2 people that I've not seen for a long time. Some people I was at Bible college with, that was great. I was able to go to 2 different churches that were celebrating pastors who've been there a very long time. 1 40 years in the same church. And in another church I visited, another friend was retiring after a long stint, 30 years I think, nearly at that church, and so it was great to be able to go there. I visited a couple of church plants or prospective church plants in Cumbria, one down Cleda Moor that started Church on the Moor, as it's called, started going just over a year ago, and I was able to go down to Shap where there's some folk gathering there who are hoping to start a church in that area, so it was great to be able to visit those. It's great to be able to go to the churches that our children go to and see how they're being cared for by their local churches, and to connect with folk there. It's great to do some reading and have some time of rest and just not be having to thinking about 20 different things at once. So it's been a great blessing, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Peter. So actually, start back. How can we be praying for you, and also how can we be praying for your family as well?
Yeah, great. So we have been able to see a little bit more of the family. Ellie and Johnny down in Sheffield, Maisie and Toby are in Oswestry, so they're not just very local, so we have been able to do a weekend in both those places. Zach is not here this morning. He's helping with the holiday club at another church, but he's about to go to start studying in Nottingham. We're able to go with him and check out some churches in Nottingham as well. We'd value prayer for him. Jed's starting his final year of school, and so he'd value prayer for that, I think. Lucy's job is changing slightly at school. She's still going to be working just 2 days, but now in slightly different roles, so she'd value prayer for that. But our big news in the family is that Ellie and Johnny are expecting. So we're about to have our first grandchild, we think, baby one, who excitingly will be with us just after Christmas, I think, sometime. So we value prayer for them and for that sort of change, a new stage of life for us. In terms of starting back to work, at my sabbatical 7 years ago, the first sabbatical the church kindly gave me, it did take me a little while to get back into the swing of things and to sort of make the shift. So it would be great just to pray for that transition back into work mode and or a different type of work or working in a different way again, and just that would just have wisdom about how that happens. There'll be some things that have changed over the sabbatical period that don't need to change back, I'm sure, and so just wisdom about that as well.
So today's reading starts in Luke chapter 19, verse 11. It's on page 1141. While they were listening to this, he went on to tell them a parable because he was near Jerusalem, and the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. He said, "A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king, and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. 'Put this money to work,' he said, 'until I come back.' But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, 'We don't want this man to be our king.' He was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for the servants to whom he had given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it. The first one came and said, 'Sir, your mina has earned 10 more.' 'Well done, my good servant,' his master replied. 'Because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter, take charge of 10 cities.' The second came and said, 'Sir, your mina has earned 5 more.' His master answered, 'You take charge of 5 cities.' Then another servant came and said, 'Sir, here is your mina. I have kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. I was afraid of you, because you are a hard man. You take out what you did not put in, and reap what you did not sow.' His master replied, 'I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, did you, that I am a hard man, taking out what I do not put in, and reaping what I did not sow? Why then didn't you put my money on deposit, so that when I came back, I could have it collected in with interest?' Then he said to those standing by, 'Take his mina away from him, and give it to the one who has 10 minas.' 'Sir,' they said, 'he already has 10. He replied, 'I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who did not want me king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me.'"
Well, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Andy, for leading us in that first part. It is a great blessing to be back with you, although I'm slightly nervous. I'm feeling a bit rusty. Can I still do this? I don't know. We'll find out. You might be thinking, could you do before? Do keep that open in front of you. It was page 1141 in the church Bibles. I will be referring to some of those verses as we go through. Well, one of the things that I enjoy, as some here will know, is watching films. And sabbatical has not really given me an opportunity to watch many films, surprisingly. I thought I might be able to watch a few more films, but maybe it's because it's summer and it's not dark night. But here's a film that you may not have seen. It's from 1937. A film called You Only Live Once, and here's what happens. That lady there, played by Sylvia Sidney, is a secretary in the Public Defender's Office, and she works with her boss to get a guy released early who's in prison, and she actually has fallen in love with him through communicating with letters, and when he gets released early, she marries him. But it's a very sad story from that point on. And if you know the story of Bonnie and Clyde, it ends up being a bit like that. He drags her down into this sort of terrible life. And I don't want to give any more away. That film was 1937, so even pre-Second World War. But that name, or that idea, you only live once, there was being used to say, therefore, live wisely. Look at this example of this lady who's not chosen wisely. And in the first part of the film, people try and warn her of the dangers of what she's doing. Skip forward to our day, and here's somebody else that you may recognise, you might not. It's a Canadian rapper called Drake. And he picked up on this idea of you only live once in quite a few of the lyrics of his songs. And now, in our day, rather than it being a warning about how to live, it expresses a view that you should make the most of the present and not worry so much about the consequences because you only live once. Or as it's sometimes shortened to, YOLO. It's the idea behind lots of middle-aged men buying Harley Davidsons and stuff like that. I don't know what the female equivalent is, but it's the idea behind lots of unwise decisions, I would say. So in 1937, the film there was supposed to be almost like a parable, a warning against having this idea. Now it's an idea that a lot of people would pursue as something that sort of guides them in lots of their decisions in life. Well, why am I mentioning that? Well, because that's going to be an idea that comes out strongly as we look at not just this story that Jesus tells, but what is the significance of it and what does it mean for us? Why is this worth thinking about in 2024? Now, verse 11, at the very start of our section, actually tells us why Jesus told this parable. God's kingdom is not going to be as some people expect. See verse 11? While they were listening to this, and this is what's just been happening with Zacchaeus, he went on to tell them a parable because he was near Jerusalem and people thought the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. So people then were expecting Jesus to be like an earthly ruler. They were expecting this kingdom of God to be established, perhaps with Jesus King. It was something that was going to happen quickly and in a traditional way that kingdoms are established. This is just hours before Palm Sunday and people welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem. And it's just before Easter week and the events of Easter week. And Jesus wants to help them to think differently about their expectations. But that was a specific reason that Jesus was using the parable. But there's also much wider ideas for us and helpful things for us to notice. And I've picked out three that will appear on the screen now. Three things that we're going to see. One, that there's a great danger in being a rebel. Two, you only live once. The idea that we've already been thinking about. So be trustworthy. So be trustworthy, says Jesus. And thirdly, there's a danger of mistaken identity. So we're going to take those three ideas. We're going to use this section to help unpack those ideas, or use those ideas to unpack the section is perhaps a better way around to think of it. So the first is the danger of being a rebel. Now, I don't know if there's something that jarred with you as Matthew read this for us, or perhaps you looked at these verses before you came, but I don't know if you noticed that verse 14 seems a bit odd. So this man is going off to a distant country, but his subjects send a message, a delegation after him, to say to the people wherever he's gone, we don't want this man to be our king. That's a bit odd. And actually, if you took out verse 14, you just read verse 13, followed by verse 15, it just makes sense without verse 14 being in there. It seems like this odd sort of detail that's added. and we might think, what's going on? It seems a bit unnecessary. Well, there's a little bit of background, recent history for the people that Jesus is telling this story to. And the background is what's been going on in the Jewish leadership in Israel. As you probably know, the Romans were in charge, and Israel has become just a state or a region of the Roman Empire. And there'd been a man called Herod the Great. That's the Herod who appears in Jesus' birth stories. He had done a lot of building. He'd rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and everything. But he was always functioning under the Romans. The Romans were the ones really in charge, and then he was the Jewish king under them. He had 3 sons, and his kingdom was split up after his death, and different sons were given different bits. And one of them had a palace in Jericho, a man called Archelaus. And he'd had to travel to Rome to have his title confirmed. So he had to go to Rome to see the Roman emperor to confirm that he could be king. Now, he wasn't liked by the Jewish people for a couple of reasons. One, his mum was a Samaritan, and as you might know, the Jewish people didn't get on with the Samaritans very much. But he'd angered the Jews at the previous Passover, his first Passover. He was sort of in charge, but he didn't have the title of king yet. There'd been a big fallout. He brought troops into Jerusalem, and he'd killed 3,000 people who'd come to the temple at that Passover. 3,000. It's a massive massacre. And so when he goes to Rome to be confirmed as king, the Jews send a delegation to say, we don't want this man to be king. Now, this is all recent history for the people Jesus is telling this story to. And so it wouldn't have seemed a strange thing for them. They'd be thinking, oh yeah, we know all about this. Actually, he was confirmed as king, and the Romans didn't listen to the objections. Maybe they didn't see such a problem with killing 3,000 people. But if verse 14 is a struggle and seems a bit odd here, you might struggle even more with verse 27 right at the end. Have a look right at the end of our section. Verse 27, where the king, after what's been happening with what's going on, he says, those enemies of mine who didn't want me to be king, bring them here and kill them in front of me. Now, given what we know already about these 3,000 people being killed, this is maybe not surprising behaviour, but we might think, wow, this is quite a brutal end to this story. In fact, I don't think either of those verses, verse 14 or verse 27, will make it into a children's Bible version of this story. If you're reading about this story, this parable, in a children's Bible, it probably will water that down significantly, because you think, goodness me, seems like a bit of an overreaction. But Jesus' point, I think, is a simple warning. Rebel against the king's authority and expect consequences. Rebel against the king's authority and expect consequences. And actually, we've seen that just over the summer in our own country as there's been riots. And I think the government, the new government, have wanted to very much stamp down on it, make an example of some people in court. People have been appearing in court very quickly, sentences handed down very quickly. to try and stamp out what was going on. I think Jesus is pointing out, you rebel against the king's authority, or government's authority, maybe in our case, expect consequences. But there's a wider spiritual principle as well. If you live life as God's enemy, expect consequences. If you live your life sticking two fingers up at God, expect eternal consequences. If all your life you say, I don't want you, God, you keep God at arm's length, well, in eternity, he will respect your decision. He'll say, you don't want me, you don't have to have me. Now, some people who reject God, or even just the idea of God, might say, well, that doesn't sound so terrible. But an eternity separated from God is not just that. It's an eternity separated from all that makes life good. It's an eternity separated from all that brings light into life. It's an eternity separated from peace, from joy, from goodness, from contentment, from fulfillment. It's a terrible consequence of having rejected God. So Jesus uses this story, or these parts of this story, and not to scare us, but as a loving warning. As a loving warning. Rebel against the king's authority, expect consequences. Live your life as God's enemy, expect consequences. So that's the first of my three things I want us to see. There's a danger to being a rebel. And this story serves as a warning barrier. A danger, don't go there. Avoid that. And there's a second thing I wanted us to see. And that's this idea of you only live once, so be trustworthy. Now, the bulk of the parable is about these servants and what's gone on with the servants. And one of the things to notice here is that all have been given the same. They've all been treated in the same way. Now, there's a different but very similar story that Jesus tells. You can read about it in Matthew 25. And that is a different story because there, different servants have been given different amounts. But here, people have all been treated in the same way. They've been given the same thing. And there's 13 servants. Notice they're servants, not slaves. They've each been given 10 minas. And a mina is worth about 3 months' wages. So I don't know what that would mean to you, but it's a significant amount. 3 months' wages. And we've got some different outcomes, and you heard them as they were read. But you look at what the first guy's been able to do, and we see him in verse 16, and you think, wow, this is an impressive return. If you walk past the window of a bank or a building society, they sometimes have posters in there advertising the return they offer if you put some money in a savings account with them. I mean, I think 4% is good, isn't it, these days? Or just a little over that, perhaps. 10% would be an amazing return. This guy's done like 1,000%. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely astonishing return. So no wonder in verse 17, the king says, well done, my good servant. I mean, good seems a bit understated but well done, well done. At verse 17, you have been trustworthy with something that he regards as a small thing, and therefore he is given responsibility for 10 cities. Now it's obvious from Jesus' parable, this is the guy to be like. This is the one of the servants to be to aim for, isn't it? This is, wow, what a great outcome and a great reward. Well, there's a second person who's also done well and is also rewarded. If this is the person or the two here to be like, we might ask ourselves, what would it take for us to be like this? What is our mina. What have we been given? We've been given 3 months' wages. We might be thrilled to have that. But what have we been given? What can we be faithful with? Now remember that the same has been given to all 10 servants here. So that's led people to speculate. Perhaps the thing that we've all been given, if we're God's servants, is the gospel, the good news about the Lord Jesus. We've all been given that as a precious thing, and we all have a responsibility to pass that on. Perhaps it's our possessions. We all have different possessions, but we all have things that God has given us. So how do we use them for God? Might be our homes, might be our lawnmower, might be our knitting machine, I don't know. What have we got that we can use? Might be our own gifts. Things that we're good at. We've been blessed this morning by musicians and people using their gifts in that way. We've got people who are gifted with children youth work, serving us next door. We've got people who serve in so many ways in church life. But there's ways we can use our gifts beyond just Sunday morning, of course. What is our mina? What can we, as a Christian, be faithful or trustworthy with? Well, I don't think we have to pick one of those things. I think it can be all of those things, can't it? We do have the gospel, and we do have a responsibility to pass it on. We do have things that we can, possessions that we can use, and money that we can use for God's glory. We do have gifts that we've been given. So how are we using those things in a trustworthy manner? You could say it's all of life, really. How are we trustworthy with all of our life? How are we faithful and trustworthy? Now, we've just seen a sort of lived out example of this in the previous account earlier in chapter 19, in the change that comes over Zacchaeus as he becomes part of God's family. Totally changes his priorities in life and how he views his possessions. I don't think it's an accident that these two things are right next to each other here in Luke. So that brings us back to our idea that we started with. You only live once. Now, so for many people today, that means so live in the moment. But I'm saying what Jesus is saying is you only live once, so think carefully about how you use this life. Don't make foolish, rash decisions. Make this one life count for eternity. It's a bit more like the message of that 1937 film. Think carefully about how you live your life than what you only live once maybe more commonly means nowadays. So you only live once will mean we think about our stuff, our career, our gifts, our gospel opportunities differently because we only live once. Now, it's great to come back and see the church building full. And it's great to hear that people have been, over the summer, coming along. But it continues to remind us of our squish, that we can be here and also next door. And although we've been thinking and talking and praying about this for a long time, there's no easy answer. There's no easy answer to our space problems. All the answers are costly. It can be costly if we decide to multiply services and go to 2 services. That's costly in lots of ways, in relationships and the effort that takes. If we find a bigger space or try and somehow expand the amount of space we've got, that's costly financially and in disruption. We might feel, why would we do that as a church? Why would we face and go through that pain? Why would we want all that uncertainty and upset? But you only live once is one way to make sense of that. We've got to make the most of what God has given us and the opportunities He's given us. And so sometimes we have to push the boat out and seize opportunities that He's given us. It does make sense if we want more people to be able to hear the good news about Jesus. Well, that's on a sort of bigger scale as a church, but on a smaller scale, there's lots of ways in which you only live once affects our church life. It might be in the way that you're helping someone else in church with childcare, or you're visiting somebody in hospital, or how we're behaving at work or in our home situation or with our wider family. There's lots of situations we might be in where the fact we only live once and we want to live this life in a faithful way, faithful to God, that means we will act differently. It means our priorities will be slightly different. So that was the second thing. We only live once, so we want to be like the faithful servants in this story. My third and final thing that I want us to notice from here is the danger of mistaken identity. Now, do you notice the third guy? We meet him in verse 20. This servant, what a fool. He's an absolute muppet, I think. You just read it and you think, what was he thinking? What was he thinking? I've wrapped this money in a piece of cloth. Absolutely idiotic, it seems. But I think it's a stark contrast in the story, isn't it, to help us to see the contrast. He says in verse 21, he tells us why he's done it. He was afraid. And when we're afraid, we don't always act wisely, do we? Fear drives us to do some stupid things sometimes. But why is he afraid? Well, verse 21 tells us, he says, because you're a hard man. You take out what you don't put in. You reap what you don't sow. But that's not true. That's not what's happened in this story. The guy who's going to be king, the ruler, has given them 3 months' wages. He's given them that. He has put it in. It's not true. It's a warped idea of the master. It's a warped idea of how he treats people. Now, the master does treat his enemies with swift and stern justice, and we've already seen that, haven't we? But his servants here have actually been treated well. They've been given an opportunity to shine. They've been treated actually generously and fairly. They've all been treated in the same way. And the master says in verse 23, this is absolutely why he's a muppet. He says, you could have just put it in a cash ISA. If you walk past a building society, they have a sign in the window that tells you the interest rate. Doesn't quite say that. But he says, you could have put it on deposit. You wrapped it in a cloth. It's like, I put it under my mattress. I've kept it safe. You could have done something with it. The servant has mistaken the master's identity. He's had a wrong view of the master, and that has led him to act in a foolish way. It would be like us, or people we know, seeing God as a cruel taskmaster, not as a generous, loving father that the Bible shows us that he is. That would be a warped view of God, to see him as a cruel taskmaster rather than a generous, loving father. And that would change how we view using what we have for God. We would view it as an obligation, not a privilege. We would view it as a duty, not a joy. We would see it as a burden, not a delightful opportunity. We would be doing it from a place of fear not a place of loving respect. There's a big difference in those two motivations. So the other warning here is don't invent your own idea of God. Or you may end up cut off and empty and with nothing. And that's the warning of verse 26. Now in a moment we're going to share bread and wine together. And what a brilliant reminder this morning that God is for us. That Jesus, who's telling this story, is for us. He is generous to us. He has gone above and beyond in providing for us. And Jesus, within a few hours of him sharing this story, is going to enter into those events of the last week of his life. That's going to end in the cross. It's going to end in the events that we will remember as we share bread and wine together. Don't invent your own idea of God as some cruel taskmaster, some warped view, but see him as a loving Father who treats people equally, who's given us many gifts and opportunities, who's given us a great gospel to proclaim. Let's grab hold of that. Going full circle back to verse 11, Jesus says he's telling them this story because they thought the kingdom was coming soon, but they had a wrong idea of what that kingdom was going to be like. Now God's kingdom is coming. Jesus will return. That's more reliable than even that the sun will rise tomorrow morning. So let's live like we've only got one life to live, but live in the light of what he's done for us and that he's coming back.